Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and someone asked me in the Q&A thread yesterday, and I didn't get around to the question. I ended up running out of time, hitting kind of the time limit of what I wanted to do on those before I got to this question. But I got asked if I would cover 20 rep squats that people like Dante Trudeau and some other people have promoted in the past. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Yeah, 20 rep squats actually are a very effective and time-proven method to get big and strong. In fact, when I mean time-proven, a big chunk of you out there listening, people have been doing this since before you guys were born. I'm talking all the way back in the 70s and 80s. American football players were doing these in the weight room, and it works. And it works off of an interesting method that's been studied a little bit later. Some physiologists have looked into studying some of this stuff with the rest-pause training, and it's produced some interesting results. And it's not to say there aren't some downsides. I'm going to jump into this and explain some of this to you guys. A lot of people say, well, that sounds like the perfect way to train. Why doesn't everyone train that way all the time? Well, there are some downsides to it. All right, 20 rep squats are not what people think. When we're saying a 20 rep squat programs are also called Widowmakers for a reason. They're tough. People pass out doing these sometimes. It does happen. I've seen it happen. Getting a little chuckle there because, yeah, this shit can be funny. It's not funny if someone gets hurt, but it is funny. Now, 20 rep squats are not what you're thinking, where you just do your 20 rep max and do 20 reps. No. 20 rep squats are done with like your 12 rep max, meaning the most you wouldn't be able to do a 13th rep normally, like your true 12 rep max on your squats. Now, these could be done with other big exercises too, but it was popularized with squats, and so that's why the name has stuck. I mean, you could do this same thing with a bench press or a pendlay row or a push press. Hell, you could do it with chin-ups if you're strong enough to do that many, but there aren't many people out there who can crank out that many chin-ups. Although that would be one hell of a growth program for your upper body. Now that I think about it, it hadn't even occurred to me until now. But what you do, you take like your 12 rep max, you do 10 reps, and then you stop. You don't rack the bar. You leave the bar on your shoulders. So just like if you'd done this with a bench press, you would hold the bar. If you're going to do it with a chin-up, you would still stay hanging onto the bar, and you would just rest at the bottom hanging. You stay there with the bar on your shoulders. You take a few seconds, take a couple of deep breaths, and try to grind out another rep or two. Then you wait a few seconds, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Take a few deep breaths, take a nice deep breath, try to crank out another rep or two. And you take as long as you need, as many breaks as you need to get to 20 reps. That last 10 reps, some people might be taking 10 seconds between reps and trying to catch your breath and keeping that weight on their shoulders. And you push it all the way out. Now people say, well, how do you write this into a program? Well, you're pretty much done. You're not doing any other leg work that same day. That is your program for the day. And people could, in theory, do these up to 3 times a week, but you're going to just do upper body stuff after that if you do anything else that workout. Your legs are going to be pretty well shot. You're not going to be able to do much else, and if you do, it's just going to be with light weight. So, that is how you run these programs. You would do it as many times a week as you could get away with, once, twice, 3 times. There have been programs out there that were based around this, though, for bulking up football players to where they're doing these, a couple times a week. And the whole idea here is that you're doing it in one continuous set. Now, under normal circumstances, I say, and other people say, we tell you guys that if tonnage is roughly equal, hypertrophy tends to be equal, barring a few other factors. Meaning the total tonnage that you're doing on an exercise through a full range of motion, a given workload, is a big factor in hypertrophy. But what's interesting is that with the 20 rep squat, you're working in a rep range that if people only wanted to do one set, would actually stimulate some muscle growth. Meaning like a 10 to 12 reps on a squat, if that was really heavy for you, a person could do one set of that and walk out the door of the gym and grow on it. Is it going to be ideal growth? No. But you'd probably gain like half the muscle you could gain in your legs from a single workout. It would be efficient, but it wouldn't be that fantastic of gains. But it is interesting, you're in that rep range when you do it. The thing is, and this is what's been noted, when some Australian researchers a few years back, it might have been about a decade ago, I try to dig the research up later, if not, you guys could Google it yourselves. They studied this, and what they found was that when they had people do rest pause training like this, that they found that they got similar metabolites in the bloodstream from people who train this way as if they had done like 3 sets to failure by doing the 1 set. Now, that means basically had they done about 3 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 12 on the squat, they seem to get similar hormonal responses, blood marker responses when they pulled their blood work, meaning that anabolic response and catabolic response you have going on seem to be similar to people who took multiple sets to failure. But technically, you don't reach muscle failure doing this, and that's interesting. And that's interesting because it seems to induce metabolic fatigue. Every one of those rest pauses where people only do a couple reps seems to almost replicate some of the benefits of doing an entire set. Why? Because normally we talk about tonnage and things, but you need to understand what is the reason tonnage and work matter. Because tonnage and work recruit and exhaust muscle fibers. By exhausting muscle fibers to some extent, recruiting them, using them till they're fatigued, that's the main stimulator of the growth process. Most people understand that. You work a muscle hard, it's going to grow. Most people get that concept. I think we understand that for the most part. But working a muscle hard in this case is about recruiting muscle fibers. What you need to understand, you have a wide variety of muscle fibers in any given muscle. You have everything from stamina fibers, which can fire thousands and thousands of times without wearing out, all the way up to fast twitch fibers, which can only fire a couple of times. Most people get that, but there's a wide variety in between. The faster twitch fibers tend to grow easier. It's very, very difficult to make the muscle fibers you're using to run a marathon, it's very difficult to make those grow significantly. It's usually the upper threshold fibers that grow the most. That's the ones you can make grow the most. I'm not saying all muscle fibers can't grow, they can, but you're going to get a lot more growth out of those. In other words, no one's getting big doing 1,000 rep squats with a broomstick. It's not happening. Same thing, no one's getting a big chest and triceps doing 1,000 reps with a broomstick on the bench press for 2 hours straight. It's not the best growth potential. So what we find is that the highest threshold fibers usually take multiple reps to start recruiting, meaning if you can lift a weight 10 times, if you can squat or bench press or row a weight 10 times successfully, usually you don't start hitting some of the higher threshold fibers until you've done about half the set. You've got to be sometimes at rep 5 or 6 before you start recruiting a lot of the upper threshold fibers. The other stuff can handle it because it's just not heavy for you. If you can do it 10 times, it's probably maybe 70% of your max, maybe less. Right? Most of you are aware of that. That's easy. Those first 5 reps are easy with a 10 rep max. I mean, if you can bench 150 pounds 10 times, the first 5 feel like air. They're nothing. So what happens, you start exhausting the other fibers because they can't handle the weight very long. They get tired even though they're stamina fibers, but they're not strong fibers. When they start getting exhausted, the other fibers start kicking in up the road. They start firing. The fibers that get the most growth start kicking in. Well, what happens is that you take a break, you take 3 minutes, everything recovers, and you can usually replicate the same work again, and you go through the whole sequence again of exhausting some of those other fibers. They get tired, and then around rep 5, 6, 7, the upper threshold fibers start kicking in, particularly the last 2 to 3 reps. That's why we sometimes say, for optimal muscle growth, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you need to get close to failure. You don't have to reach failure, you just need to get close, at least on one set. Well, what happens when you exhaust yourself doing those first 10 reps and then you do the rest pause, you've recruited the upper threshold fibers on probably the 9th and 10th rep on your 12 rep max. When you rest a few seconds and do a couple more reps, you're hitting the upper threshold fibers again because you haven't recovered. Your muscles have not recovered enough. You go immediately back to the upper threshold fibers. It feels to your body when you go to lift that weight like you're doing a 2 or a 3 rep max. All right, it doesn't feel like your 12 rep max, it feels like your 3 rep max. You stimulate the upper threshold fibers again accordingly, but you need to understand the stamina fibers are still being hit on those reps. They're just too tired to move that kind of weight now. So you're going to the upper threshold fibers every single time. time. So when you think about that and put that in perspective, when you're doing those rest pauses, and let's say you do 5 doubles again throughout the whole thing, those last few doubles that you're doing, every time you're doing those 1 or 2 reps or those 2 reps after 5-6 seconds break, it feels like you're going almost to failure again, because as far as the muscles are concerned, you are almost hitting muscle failure. You're within a rep of failure. So it replicates stimulating the upper threshold fibers the same way it does when you get right on the edge of muscle failure. It stimulates them in the same way that causes them to grow. So a lot of the muscle fibers in your body, as far as they're concerned, you just did another entire set. You did another entire set. And it builds up a very large accumulation of fatigue without doing multiple sets. And it makes you grow. It's a very efficient way to grow with the fewest amount of reps possible. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, okay, that's fantastic. So if you do that all the time, you'll be able to do 1 set on all your big exercises and get out of the gym. Yeah, that's true. And it sounds good in theory until you try it and you realize how fucking exhausting it is. It is exhausting. And I mean, to the point to where most people act hardcore. They don't want to train that hard every time they're in the gym because it's difficult. It's exhausting. The other thing is, because it is so intense, it accumulates and builds up so much fatigue when you train this way that it's easy to overtrain this way. You can find yourself slipping past the overreaching point very quickly doing this. All right, and then you're going to regress. So that's a problem. The other problem, one of the big problems of going to failure on big heavy lifts, what happens when you go to failure? Or sometimes you get within 1 rep of failure. If you don't have your technique mastered, when you get tired, when you get exhausted, your form breaks down. What happens when your form breaks down on big heavy exercises? There's a risk of injury. When you train this way, particularly if you start training this way a lot, it is very, very easily possible to lose what's going on in your head, to lose your concentration, lose your good technique. All right, so the risk of injury with this style of training is a little bit higher. All right, there is a higher injury risk because of loss of focus when you get fatigued, when you get tired. And that's the same thing. People who train to failure all the time run into this exact same problem. They get hurt easy because their form breaks down. Shitty form with a moderately heavy weight is a good way to rip stuff, to tear stuff, to injure yourself. All right? So when you think about this, you start getting tired. Your brain can sometimes clock out when you get really exhausted. You're having to take enormous breaths, to keep doing another rep. It can be exhausting, and your brain can kind of lose track of what you're doing. Your form can start to break down when you get really fatigued and you lose focus. And that's how people get hurt. So the other downside of this is that you can get hurt easily unless you're very, very focused on what you're doing. Unless you have really good technique, good form, and you've mastered your form, this sort of training can get you hurt. It can cause injuries. It's really only for those who have their form dialed in really, really well in a way that they're not going to hurt themselves, and people who can focus all the way through the set. So that means that it really isn't for everyone. So it's one of those styles of training that can work extremely well, but it's not for everyone because people who don't do it correctly, there's a risk of injury. It is very easy to overtrain doing this, and quite frankly, it can be flat out exhausting to come in and do this day in and day out. You come in and train like this 3 days a week, it can quite honestly exhaust you to the point to where you don't want to go to the gym anymore. Those are the downsides of it. But as far as it stimulating enormous amounts of muscle growth and strength, works fantastically well, and it's been proven for decades. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.